ways that you can justify this by saying that, well, the utility functions could be mapped to any set of preferences that are ordinal. You hear this a lot. But the point is that the way that they're constructing, at least the utility function, is that you consume a certain quantity of goods, and it gives you a certain quantity of utility, much different than the way Austrians conceive of it. And they make a lot of assumptions about the scope of the consumer's knowledge as well. So you have to be able to isolate one consumption bundle. In the neoclassical view, you have to rule out all other possible bundles. But in Austrian economics, we understand that for you to make a decision, you just have to make a comparison of two possible states of affairs: the one in which you consume blank and the one in which you don't consume blank, for example. Okay, moving on to mainstream macro. And once again, I'm just trying to lay out the case for, or show you why the mainstreamists love their data. And once we go from micro to macro, there's no big surprise. Hopefully, they're also very mathematical, right? The macro models there's not more high-minded, very sophisticated math in the macro than there is in micro. I have a few examples up here. There's the Keynesian models with average supply and average demand. I'll talk a little bit more about the Keynesian models when we go through the GDP in just a second. But the point is that these are all math-driven. With the solo growth models, you're plugging in numbers to get a growth rate for the economy, there's some depreciation rates and so on. And then there's the dynamic, stochastic, generally delivered models where you're applying a certain numerical shock to the economy to see what the result is. Numerical result is. It's all math everywhere. Okay, so finally, let's get to some data. The way GDP is thought of is it's if you put a sensor up to the pipeline, the flow of money in the circular flow, then you're measuring total spending, you're measuring total income. And so that's the reason why they like GDP is because it's a measure of the circular flow. So let's look at GDP. You can open up any principles textbook and see this definition. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country over a given time period. And they use prices as a common denominator, but we'll see that even though they use this common denominator with market prices, there's still some heterogeneity within GDP that's problematic. They rule out intermediate goods, and the reason why is because they don't want to double count the problems. We'll see that there's an issue with that as well. They only look at domestic production and commodities. And it's over a specific time period, so it's a flow variable. It's all based on this Keynesian approach to why the time to have an open economy include like net exports as well. These first issues with GDP you'll actually find in the textbooks. You'll find in the principles. They'll give you the definition and they'll say, here's what GDP is, and here's all the problems with it. So you would think that they're going to do a little bit of introspection, maybe fix some of these problems, acknowledge it. If we're acknowledging it at the principle level, we aren't acknowledging it at the higher level. But the issues that they point out is that you're ignoring household production. So since you're adding up all spending, if you're producing something but it's not exchanged in the market, so that's even though it's a part of the actual product that it's not in a similar way of like markets that another issue is that not much of a correlation there. There's lots of things. So either the survey data is wrong or GDP is wrong, or at least we take these GDP per capita to measure all the things. Austrians, we get to just say, well, maybe they're both wrong. Survey data. And another issue with GDP to do is that leisure is valuable. It's actually stopping production. Relaxing the weekend, retiring at the end of your career is valuable. We like that. But it would decrease GDPs. We're getting something that we want, and it decreases GDP. Alright, so these next three, these are more Austrian. So we'll spend a little bit more time on these. Even though they have the market price as a common denominator, the stuff inside GDP is very heterogeneous. First of all, consumption is different than investment. And government spending, as we see in point 7 here, is extremely different. It actually should probably be excluded. Depending on the sort of question you're trying to answer. But it's not just heterogeneous inside, it's also heterogeneous throughout the population, meaning that the GDP doesn't tell you anything about the distribution of wealth or the distribution of income throughout the economy. It doesn't tell you anything about growth potential. So GDP could be massive, but if it's because we're just going through a big consumptive binge, like in the artificial, the boom bust cycle, then GDP is increasing, and you might, if you're a macroeconomist, you might think, oh, we're on this nice trajectory of growth, right? But if you're an Austrian economist, you know, well, actually, you have to maintain your structure of production. Your structure of production is consistent in time subsistence. So last period of production, you don't have that, and you're actually, you don't have much growth. Also the size of the population. Consumption is exaggerated. GDP is not means that if you're a politician perhaps who's trying to make policy based on what are the important things in the economy, and you're looking at GDP, you would come to this bad conclusion that consumption is really important to the economy. However, you're missing out on a lot of investment spending. So consumption spending is exaggerated as a proportion of GDP. If you include all of the other spending on the intermediate products in the structure of production, then we put consumption in its place. It's a much smaller proportion of our Western industrialized
market, which is the same thing as
you get a bad picture of the importance of consumption in the GDP. We'll talk there's a picture of this. And finally, most importantly, I would say, government is different. Right, so consumption spending is based on people's own net worth calculations, and they have their own preferences, their own budgets. Right, they're making decisions on what to buy. Investment spending is based on similar preferences and anticipations about the future. It's based on profit calculation, profit anticipation. The same thing applies to net exports. So exports and imports are people, trading goods across borders based on their own preferences and profit calculations. But government is not subject to those sorts of things. The level of government spending is based on political whims. It's based on politicians and what helps them get elected. It's the stuff that government spends money on is not necessarily related to what consumers value. That's a very controversial statement here at Mises University, but there's not a connection there. Since their revenues is based on forcible taxation or through the printing press, right? They get their money this way, and then they spend money on stuff. But there's no connection, right? It's not like you pay more taxes because you like what the government is producing for you, right? There's no connection like there is in the private market where producers they make stuff for a profit, and they only make the sale that they convince the consumer that what they're giving up, the payment for the product is less important to them than the product that they're receiving, as we've seen this week. So, and the private producers they convince the consumer that what they're giving up, the payment for the product is less important to them than the product that they're receiving, as we've seen this week. So, government expenditures are just categorically different than the other things. They should probably be excluded in certain situations, like what Robert Hicks does in this article about the myth of wartime prosperity. If you look at GDP through World War II, it looks like we had a gigantic economic boom. And the reason why is because the government was spending money because you war, right? So a huge increase in G, right? So the government spending component of GDP was just massive, right? Because we were spending lots of money on different things. However, if you take the government spending component out, you get private GDP. So here's a great Austrian alternative to conventional economic statistics. Private GDP takes government spending out of GDP, and you get a better picture of what your average Joe experienced during wartime, which was basically a depression. But look at the dip there in private GDP. It looks almost like the Great Depression that was a few years before. We did not have wartime prosperity. We had wartime depression. We had wartime shortages. They had to ration all sorts of consumer goods during the war as well. So this was not, if you pretend you don't see the black bars, right? If you're just looking at GDP, you're like, oh wow, war is great for the economy. As we know that this is because of the broken window fallacy, right? We know that this is wrong. Then if you look at the data in a correct way, you see, oh yeah, there's the cost of the war right there. We had to take a cut into what regular people, what the citizens are consuming. Another important result that we get from this exercise is you'll notice that if you just look at GDP, it looks like we have this massive depression, massive recession. Right? And all the Keynesian economists were saying that. They're saying in the war, that we're still good back to great So what's actually felt and experienced by the citizens of the United States was totally different than what GDP reflected. It's because government spending is categorically different. David Howard, who goes through a similar exercise, he's looking at the impact of recessions on two different groups: private workers and public workers. People who work in the private market economy and people who work for the government. And if you divide government spending by public workers, then there's really not much of a bad effect of a recession. The recession mainly affects private workers. Another great conclusion here. Since government is not subject to the profit and loss test of the market, recessions don't really matter to them. In fact, government's doing quite well there. Another great using Austrian insights, coming up with better So you remember I talked about how consumption is exaggerated in GDP. One way that we can get around that is by just including all the intermediates. There's a good reason to do that, namely because it exists. So here's the Austrian consumption production, production. There is spending, right? All the consumption goods at the bottom. There's also a lot of spending. So if you want to measure a total spending, you should include all of those. And if you do that, you can look for gross output or gross domestic one nice result here is that there's more variation in gross output during the recession. You see the recession there, that's when gross output is down. So there's more variation in gross output. Why is that? Paying attention to what lecture yesterday on Wall Street Business Secretary. A huge collapse in demand for capital. Those specific capital goods that increase in value during a recession in the West. So you see that very clearly in gross output because you have all these statements. The red line at the bottom, there is a small decrease, right? At least relatively small. It's not as clear. Something like looking at or measuring recession. You're right about a lot of these things. Something like gross output. Let's talk about the price level. A lot of people hate the price level. We don't hate it. We just don't think that it exists for a price level. But to set up the problem, mainstream economists like to be able to talk about price levels, but there's a very serious units problem. It's the average price, and the units problem is this. Suppose you're going to bundle the average consumer average price of this, $10 burrito, haircut, and then if you add all those prices divided by 3, you get a number. But if you ask the person what the units is, you get Finally, most importantly, like I mentioned, there's no such thing as a price level. So we would like for the statistics that we're coming up with, if we're trying to apply economic theories in history, we would like for the numbers that we're coming up with to relate to whether our country is experiencing there's no such thing as a price level is one number. The price level is best considered as an array. It's all of the prices. Right? All of the prices that consumers face. Great quotes from Mises that housewives, those who do the spending, they go to the grocery store and buy the goods for their household, they are in a better position to measure in price inflation than the government officials with their price levels. Right? Simply because that's what the price level is. It's the price level. A good quote from Rothbard here on that specific point.
What do you do?
Let's look at money supply measures. The way that the money supply measures are put together is based on liquidity. So they have the money's